Hi, you're watching The Real Story. I'm Lori Perez. The Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of the sweeping health care reform law. In a complex ruling, the justices upheld the law. Stacey Cohen takes a look at the details from the Supreme Court.
It was a highly anticipated ruling on polarizing legislation. And on the final day before summer recess, the Supreme Court ruled on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. At the heart of the controversy, the individual mandate. It required most Americans to be covered by health insurance or pay a fine. In a narrow vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled that provision is constitutional under the clause of the Constitution that deals with taxes. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion saying, quote, "The federal government does not have the power to order people to buy health insurance. The federal government does have the power to impose a tax on those without health insurance." It is a huge victory for the president. This is considered the signature legislation of his time in office. Mr. Obama says the court's decision goes beyond politics.
Whatever the politics, today's decision was a victory for people all over this country whose lives will be more secure because of this law.
Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney repeated his pledge to work for repeal of the so-called Obamacare if elected.
What the court did not do on its last day in session, I will do on my first day if elected president of the United States. And that is, I will act to repeal Obamacare.
So that is the immediate political fallout from this ruling. However, the long-term fallout will be measured in a matter of months. As this is an election season, you can expect to hear much more about health care. In Washington, I'm Stacey Cohen. Back to you.
And we have assembled a powerhouse panel to help us understand what all that means and to delve into the finer points and effects of the decision. Our thanks to Professor Bilal Sakou, a political science professor at the University of Hartford. Proloy Das, he's an attorney at the Hartford law firm of Rome McGuigan. Deb Poland, Director of Government Affairs for the Community Health Center Association of Connecticut. Ellen Andrews is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Health Policy Project, and current business and insurance reporter Matt Sturdivant. Thanks, all of you, for being here. We certainly have a lot to talk about. In Proloy, I think we're going to pick on you first to talk about, I've heard a lot of legal experts in the hours following the decision talking about how stunning they thought this decision was. First of all, that the Chief Justice was kind of the one who crossed the line, and also the reasoning that he used. And I'm wondering if you are equally surprised by that?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't that surprised by the alignment in the sense that the real question here is whether the individual mandate was constitutional and whether the federal government, under the Commerce Clause of the federal Constitution, can force someone to go buy a product. And the Chief Justice aligned with Scalia, Alito, Thomas, and made a conclusion that, of course, and actually Kennedy, who was the swing vote, agreed with them that you can't force someone to go buy a product. But what the Chief Justice did was very interesting, which was to say, but we're not going to declare the act unconstitutional because under the tax clause, we're going to determine that this isn't really a mandate, regardless of what it's called. It's really just a tax on individuals who don't carry health insurance. So I really wasn't surprised by the decision. I thought it was a great rule of law decision.
And the reasoning, was anyone else surprised by the reasoning? Were you expecting it, or?
I was surprised. They asked, I know that, this isn't necessarily the case, but they asked some really tough questions in March. And I think we were all, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. And luckily, we didn't have to do it. We don't have to worry about it.
And I think what's interesting about those questions they asked, which were all about the Commerce Clause, is it really showed how this decision came down. The government really did not want to call this a tax. And so they were really advocating for this to be affirmed under the Commerce Clause. And I think there was a real concern from the right side of the bench, and certainly from the states, that the federal government's powers were going to be overreaching. And so this was a nice compromise position, I think, that was reached. Commerce Clause doesn't allow the feds to do this, but there is a way to affirm it, even though you don't want to call it a tax. It's really what it is, and you can do it under the tax power.
I think that really tees up an interesting political question leading up to the presidential election, though, because you've got the Supreme Court saying, yes, Congress did overreach their rights to say what should happen, but also, if it's going to happen, it's going to be a tax. And I wonder what will happen in November.
Bilal, what do you think?
Yeah, I think actually this kicks open the door for at least 3 key arguments I think Republicans are going to make in the lead up to the election. One, that Obama has basically imposed a tax on the middle class. And if you listen to any of the talk today, that's been a lead argument. The second one is that, yes, it's constitutional, but it's bad public policy. And I think if you listen to Mitt Romney today, that was the centerpiece of his argument. I think the third piece of this, of course, I heard Michelle Bachmann talk about this, which is that people are being forced to purchase health care, and that this goes against fundamental freedoms, right? Your freedom to sort of not have health care if you don't want it. So I think, you know, from a political standpoint, it really kicks open the door for Republicans to make those arguments and to raise money on the basis of those arguments. And I think, you know, it's what it really is incumbent upon the president and the Democrats to do is to counter those arguments that isn't what's going on, and that this is good public policy for the country.
And you have already heard some people trying to counter it, likening it to, for example, the Social Security contributions we make, and saying, well, you know, or I heard someone else saying it's like when you pay taxes, and, you know, if you don't have children, well, then you pay a different rate than someone who does have children. So it wouldn't be. It will be likened to that.
And I think if you look at these from a historical standpoint, you know, in the 1960s, Medicare was not popular. There were other programs that were not popular. But as people got into these programs and realized the benefits they received from these programs, I think over time the popularity increased. And I think this health care plan has, you know, that kind of a potential to do that. There's certainly elements of the plan now that lots of people like, and I think would be pretty upset if they were stripped away from them. And so in that sense, I think it has the ability to grow on people. And I think over time, as people learn more about what exactly is in the plan, which is not really clear that people understand the plan very clearly, but I think, and also as they experience the benefits, I think the attitudes about it will evolve as well.
And before we get into this, to some of how it might have potential and how it might change healthcare, I wanted to ask Proloy, you know, part of the more, one of the more complicated parts of the ruling, I think, for people as they kind of digest it, is understanding what exactly happens with the whole Medicaid portion of it. And I wonder if you could kind of explain.
Sure. So, you know, there were 2 main issues. Of course, the individual mandate was really just one portion of this, and then the second portion that was being challenged was the Medicaid portion. So what the federal government did, what Congress did, was in order to increase the number of individuals that were getting coverage through Medicaid, is they broadened the eligibility requirements. And so states are responsible for providing Medicaid with federal funding, and they've been receiving these for the years. This was a significant broadening of the eligibility requirements, and the Fed said, we will pay for the first part of it the first year, but then we're going to phase it out, so 90%, 80%, so forth. So there was going to be an increased cost to the states. And if you don't take this eligibility requirement, we're going to cut off all your funding on Medicaid. Now, under the federal Constitution, and of course this all comes down to whether the federal government has the authority to act on the federal Constitution, Congress has under the spending clause the ability to provide funding to states conditioned on certain things. And you see that with our highway transportation, the DUI rates, you know, 0.08, you know, things along those lines. And it's been very broad. This is the first case, and I can remember under the spending clause, the Supreme Court has said, you've gone too far. You cannot, this isn't voluntary if you're going to take away the other eligibility requirements. And so that's the part they stripped, and then they actually severed that portion to keep the rest of the act constitutional.
It's a lot to talk about. We're going to have to take a quick break. We're going to continue to talk about the health care debate and why, even with this decision, it is not only far from over, but now many say it is intensified. We'll come back.